Hello and welcome to this updated video about delegated legislation. I'm going to start by looking at bylaws, and this forms part of the AQA A-Level Paper 3. And the specification says that in relation to delegated legislation, you need to cover the three different types of delegated legislation: orders in council, statutory instruments and bylaws. You need to look at parliamentary and judicial controls. You need to look at why we use delegated legislation. And lastly, the advantages and disadvantages of delegated legislation, the evaluation question, which is worth 7 marks. So the key to a good answer on delegated legislation is to make sure you define the type that you are asked to explain, that you always say it's made under the authority of a parent or enabling act, and that you give examples, and that when you give the example, you give both the act of Parliament that gives the power, and you give the name of the delegated legislation itself. And we'll have a look at how to do that later in the video. So bylaws, sometimes spelt byelaws, are laws made by local councils and public bodies. So there's two different people that can make a bylaw, and they've been given the lawmaking power by Parliament under a parent or enabling act. So the Parent Act is sometimes called enabling and is primary legislation. So it is the first port of call for legislation for Parliament, and under that act you can give power to different bodies to make these three sorts of delegated legislation. And delegated legislation is sometimes called secondary legislation because it comes underneath the primary legislation. So there are three types, and we're focusing on bylaws. So bylaws are made under acts like the Local Government Act 1972 and under other acts of Parliament as well, and we'll look at some of those later. They have to be approved by a government minister, and they are enforceable in court. So let's have a look at our first example of a bylaw. And this is where local councils deal with matters affecting their local area. And they do this by means of a bylaw. And this example is in relation to fining people who allow dogs to foul and then they don't pick it up. So people that do that can be fined under local bylaws called Public Spaces Protection Orders, and those are made under the Anti-Social Behaviour, Crime and Policing Act 2014. Because that has the word Act in it, you know that that is the Parent Act, and it's under that Act that power is given to local councils to make these Public Spaces Protection Orders, which are bylaws but are known as orders. And under the PSPO, you can make rules and regulations with respect to people who don't clear up after their dogs. You can also do other things such as banning alcohol. So under the same act, the Anti-Social Behaviour, Crime and Policing Act 2014, you can make these PSPOs, Public Spaces Protection Orders, and they can ban drinking in certain designated areas. For example, the council might want to ban drinking in an area of the town centre. So now we move on to the other sorts of body that can make bylaws, and that is companies. Certain companies, public bodies and companies, can deal with matters affecting their own property. And one example of this is train companies. They are allowed to make bylaws imposing fines for non-payment of fares under the Railways Act 1993. And again, the Parent Act here is clear because it has the word Act in it, the Railways Act 1993, and you make the bylaws under it. And the last example of a public body is the National Trust. And the National Trust can make bylaws affecting its properties, for example, as you can see in the picture here, in relation to litter or lighting fires, damaging plants or trees, camping, those sorts of things. And they're all made under the National Trust Act 1907, and that is the Parent Act. So to practice your knowledge of bylaws, here is one multiple choice question, and this is one of the ways in which you'll be examined in the A-level paper. There's multiple choice questions, 5-mark questions and 7-mark questions on English legal system. So let's have a look at this multiple choice question. So choose the best definition of the use of bylaws. So some of these might be right, but they will not be the best definition. So bylaws are used by local councils and by corporations to make laws relevant to their area. We know that that is true, so let's look at the others. Bylaws are only used to make local law. Well, we know they are used to make local law, but we also know that they're used by corporations in relation to their affairs, like the railways and the National Trust. Bylaws are used to bring an Act of Parliament into force. Well, that's not true. That's a statutory instrument, which we'll look at in another video. And companies can use bylaws to make rules about their property. We know that's true, but the best definition is A, because it deals with both the local councils and the corporations. So the other way that you might be asked a question is a 5-mark explain question or a 7-mark evaluation question as part of question 11. So we'll deal with those in a later video. Let's look at the 5-mark question, which might be something like explain the use of bylaws as a form of delegated legislation. And to make sure you answer that question satisfactorily, remembering you'll only have about 5 minutes to answer it, is to make sure you define what a bylaw is, and that you give examples of bylaws, and that you always mention when you're giving those examples both the Parent Act and the bylaw itself, and that you explain as much as you can remember about the information on bylaws that we've covered, such as that they have to be approved by a government minister. So I hope that video has been useful. Thanks a lot.